So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had this quote. He said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but is the assessment that something else is more important than fear." I think there's a lot of wisdom in those words. And I think when people picture courage, the first early instinct is to think, well, that's just the absence of fear. It's not being afraid of anything, even though that, of course, is completely unrealistic, that everyone experiences fear. The question is, like, what do we do when we come to those moments of fear? Is there something that's going to make it worth facing those fears? That's where courage is actually found. And then for the Christian, I think that these words can take on an even deeper meaning for us. We, who know who Christ is and what he has done for us, know that we've been given a greater mission and purpose. So we will face our fears. We, who are Christians, know that God gives us not a spirit of timidity or of fear, but one of boldness, so we will gladly face our fears. We, who know the gospel, know that we have something that is greater than any situation or any circumstance of life, even greater than life and death itself, and so we will gladly face those fears. I got a little note in my ESV study Bible. It says, faith is the antidote to fear. That when we have faith, it allows us to overcome whatever it is that we are afraid of. It's that relationship between faith and fear that's going to be played out over true dramatic stories here in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus has begun his ministry at this point. He's out preaching and teaching and healing, and he's casting out demons. He's chosen his 12 disciples to follow him. People follow Jesus for a mixture of reasons. Some follow just because they want something from him. The precious few seem to be following because they want to understand who Jesus is and understand more about this kingdom. Many just reject Jesus because of his radical grace that he presents in his gospel. There's all these various responses as Jesus goes through his ministry. And then last week, we were in chapter 4, and Mark records an example of Jesus' teachings, which is primarily done in parables. And thank you to Michael DePalma for preaching that sermon. His first sermon here at Grace Life, did a fantastic job. And one of the things that Michael pulled out of that is this repeating theme in there, that there's so many who are going to have ears and they're going to hear what Jesus is going to say, but they're not really going to hear or listen. So many people have eyes and are able to see what Jesus is doing, but they're not able to somehow see what that means or who he is. Sadly, that's going to be played out in today's passages. As Jesus, what he's going to do is he's going to reveal who he is with these miraculous works of power and authority. And the disciples, sadly, are going to be an example of those who see, but they don't really see. Those who hear, but they don't really hear, because they choose fear instead of faith. And so today we're looking at this last part of chapter 4 and then the first half of chapter 5, these two miracle stories. And it's going to play on that idea of fear and faith. And sadly, in these stories, we're going to see people choosing fear over faith and what the result of that is. That's going to set us up for next week, which will be the happier one, when we have the other half of chapter 5, two more miracle stories, but those will be examples of people choosing faith over fear and what that means for them. So the question that's going to be raised today and in today's passage is that Jesus has revealed who he is. Like, through his miraculous powers, he shows who he truly is. The question is, how are the people going to respond? Are they going to choose faith or fear? This is the question then that we have to wrestle with. See, Jesus has revealed who he is. These are not stories. These are not metaphors. This is history. Jesus has shown who he is. How will we choose to respond? That's the question they had to answer. That's the question we have to answer today. And so today we are going to go through these two stories together. We're going to see this relationship between faith and fear and the various people in the story. And then we're going to circle back to that question and say, okay, so what are we going to do and how are we going to respond to who Jesus is? And I'm going to try to outline for us what happens when we choose the response of fear, what happens for us when we choose that response of faith. And then we'll take a brief moment and we're going to pause and say, okay, so what am I choosing in my own life? And so the first story comes with Jesus calming a great storm. We are in Mark chapter 4, starting at verse 35. It says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him, and they said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind and the sea. 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased. and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear. And they said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So having just finished his teachings, Jesus now tells the disciples to go ahead and get the boat, and they're going to cross to the other side. Probably a couple of reasons for this. One is probably the crowd. That's actually, if you recall from earlier in Mark, that's why Jesus had them get a boat in the first place. Because the crowd, it keeps trying to get close to Jesus, largely because they want to touch him, thinking they're going to get a miracle out of it, that they actually risk crushing him, the one that they're actually trying to get to. And so in order to prevent that, Jesus has the boat ready to go so he can step onto it. That's probably a part of the reason, but we're going to see here that there's a deeper reason as well. Jesus is not going to just get on the boat. He wants to go to the other side to advance his ministry in another area. The area they're going to go to across the sea is going to take him into what's called Gentile territory, non-Jewish people. The people that these people, these disciples would have been afraid to interact with, that's where Jesus is going to advance that mission, and that's going to come into play in our second miracle story. And then Mark gives us another seemingly very incidental detail. He says, and there were some other boats with them, which is kind of interesting, right? Like if you've ever seen a painting of this very famous story or you picture it in your mind, usually we only picture the disciples there, not the least of which reasons being is that Luke and Matthew both omit that detail. And so it adds nothing to the story. It doesn't do anything. Well, there are other boats with them, so what? And so scholars who spend tons of time trying to analyze all of these different gospel texts, believers and non-believers alike, they actually don't know what to do with that detail because it adds so little. The only explanation that scholars seem to be able to come up with is that Mark is recording the exact words of an eyewitness. That's the only reason that these extra details work their way into the story seemingly pointlessly. Think about that for a moment. Because the witness for Mark would be Peter. Peter is reporting this to Mark as it would have happened. Again, these are not stories. They're not metaphors. Jesus is going to calm a literal storm. He's going to cast out a literal demon. And the people are going to choose to respond with a literal fear instead of a literal faith. Right? That's what's happening here. That's the significance of those details. And so as they are crossing along to the other side, a great storm seems to come out of nowhere. This is actually not that surprising of a scene. You think, well, they're fishermen, they should be able to read the storms. But the Sea of Galilee is actually notoriously famous for storms just like this. That there's these mountain sides and the wind starts to whip across it, and seemingly out of nowhere, great storms can suddenly descend upon the sea. And so this is a particularly violent storm, though, that not only rocks the boat, the waves are so high, the water is crashing into the boat, which threatens to sink everybody. And where is Jesus in this terrifying moment? He's in the stern, lying on a cushion. He's asleep, real comfortable. Everything's really nice. How can Jesus sleep? I like to think, actually, what it is because the way Mark records it, this is after his teaching of the parables. I like to think what this is an example of the ever-popular Sunday pastor's nap. I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but almost every pastor I know says that, the preaching is tiring, so they get home and they're tired, and so, that's why they put on football so then they can just fall asleep. And so maybe that's what Jesus has done. He's taught, and now he's fallen asleep. I will say, though, I think maybe that's not true. I think what actually is happening is that pastors are seeing people sleep like while they're preaching, and they're like, man, that nap sounds really good. So that's like all they can think about. And then they get home and they want a nap. I mean, that just seems like a good explanation, but that's besides the point. Now, Jesus has confidence in the Father. He knows he's safe in the Father's hands, so he is not worried about the storm. The disciples, on the other hand, understandably worried about water coming into the boat, rush down to find Jesus, and they wake him up. The question that they ask, the way it's phrased in the ESV, is, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" However, that's not an actual question. It's actually a rebuke. What they are saying is, Jesus, you do not care that we are perishing. They're saying, Jesus, you are able to sleep because you don't even care that we are about to die. What in reality was this confidence that Jesus has in the Father, they have mistaken somehow as a lack of love for them. But then the most amazing part comes as Jesus then rebukes the storm. He says, "Peace, be still." And the storm stops. And as the storm instantly drifts into its calm, the disciples just stare and wonder, did that just happen? Because if it did, and Jesus did it, then he did something that only God is able to do. Psalm 65, it calls God the one who stills the roaring of the seas. the roaring of their waves, and the tumult of the peoples. Psalm 89 says, "Who is as mighty as you, O Lord? You rule the raging sea. When its waves rise, you still them." Isaiah and Nahum, the prophets, they both call God, quote, "the one who rebukes the sea." See, Jesus, he has shown he doesn't just have power to preach and teach. He doesn't just have power to heal. He doesn't just have power to cast out demons, though he has all those things. He has power over nature itself, which is a power only the divine creator can possess. Jesus has revealed who he is. He sees the disciples staring at him in disbelief, and so he asks them questions. He says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" After all they've seen Jesus do, their response is a lack of faith. If they had had faith, they would not be afraid. As we quoted from the ESV Study Bible earlier, faith is the antidote to fear. If they had had faith, they would know that the Father's not going to allow them to die in that storm. The Father's not going to allow his Son, his chosen Messiah, to drown at the bottom of the sea. But they were clouded by their fear. And so they came and they rebuked Jesus for a lack of love instead. At this moment, now Jesus has even raised the question, they once again have an opportunity to choose. Jesus has revealed who he is. Will it be faith or fear for them? And verse 41 says their response is they are filled with great fear. They recognized they had just had an encounter with the divine. But rather than giving them hope, it gave them fear. They are afraid to be with someone who has so much power, even though he just used that power to save them. And so their fear drives them to have a lingering question that they do not answer. They say, "Who is this then, that even the winds and the seas obey him?" In preparation for, not just for this sermon, but all of them through Mark, I've been going back through my notes when I journaled through Mark about, 5 years ago or so on my own. And on this particular verse, I have a little side note that I put down there and said, that's a really good question, but only if people will allow themselves to hear the correct answer. Right? That is the ultimate question. Who then is this? And people, because they're driven by fear, they choose all sorts of responses that don't make sense because they have to deal with the fact that Jesus revealed who he is. Some people will say, well, maybe he didn't exist. Well, then how did he get disciples and turn the world upside down? Some people will say, well, he was just a good moral teacher. Then how does he work miracles? Why was he crucified? Why do the witnesses say that he was resurrected? Who then is this? That's the question that actually hangs over the entire Gospel of Mark. Who then is this? But sadly and routinely, people over and over again choose fear, and they're able to see but not really see. They're able to hear but not really hear, and so they aren't able to come to the correct answer even though Jesus has plainly shown them who he is. That's what fear does. We then come to our second story where Jesus is going to cast out a legion of demons. We're in chapter 5 now. It says, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and broke the shackles into pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. And night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones." So I mentioned earlier, this is a trip now into Gentile territory, which would have been shocking for the disciples to even go to. It's not 100% clear where the Gerasenes are, or why Matthew changes it to the Gadarenes, or why some of the manuscripts flip-flop between the two places. But we can piece enough together. There's the inclusion of the pigs, which would not be seen in Jewish territory. There's the various terms that is used here for God. The Most High God and Lord would have been Gentile terms for the Israelite God. And then there's the term Decapolis. All that points to this is a Jewish mission, this is a Gentile mission that they are now expanding to. That Jesus is making it clear that God's kingdom will not be confined to any man-made territory or border, but the kingdom of God is going to begin its invasion all over the earth and to all peoples. But as they pull their boat onto the shore, it says they're immediately greeted by what would be a terrifying sight. This man possessed by demons. At this point, he would be, his hair would be unkempt. He would be clothed with only rags, maybe still having some of the leftover pieces of chains and shackles that he's broken apart. his body covered with cuts and scars from all of the self-inflicted wounds he has done over the years. It'd be a terrifying physical appearance. What seems to us, though, to be as a terrifying physical appearance is really, though, when you think about it, it's a picture of all of us. That he really, in his condition, is exactly as we are. That he is possessed by the powers of evil, and he is unable to save himself. He dwells amongst the dead like he's some sort of living dead man. He's self-destructive to himself in his current state, and he longs for someone to come and to break him free, but no one can. Now we, of course, we are not demon-possessed, but we are held captive by the powers of evil, unable to change and unable to break free. We do not dwell amongst literal tombs, but we do live as living dead people, spiritually dead, dwelling with others who are spiritually dead like us. We do not literally cut ourselves with stones and cry out in the night, but we are self-destructive in our own habits of sin and unable to actually stop and change. And we long for someone to come in and to set us free and to change things. But no one can until Jesus. And then Jesus comes and everything begins to change. Verse 6, it says, when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and he fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, and let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out, and they entered the pigs and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and they drowned in the sea. So now there's this conflict between Jesus and the demon that possesses the man, because Jesus has already begun to tell the demon, you need to come out of him. But it becomes clear that this demon is not going to be so easily exorcised as the other ones before him, that he has a lot more power, which the reason is going to become apparent. It's because it's more than one demon. It is many of them, which is really going to make Jesus' victory all the more impressive. And so the demons, they try their various tactics. Once again, they try to state Jesus' names and titles. We saw the earlier demons do that, and we talked about how it was common in the day for an exorcist. They believed that if they knew a demon's name and could state it, they could gain power over it, and that would assist with the exorcism. And the demon seems to constantly trying to reverse those tactics by saying who Jesus really is. The irony of that, though, is the demons have actually just answered the disciples' question. The question that they had on the boat, well, who then is this? And the demon says, he is Jesus. He is Son of the Most High God. That's the answer to the question. And the disciples, they're witnessing all of this. They would hear the demon see that. They know the answer to the question. But again, they're going to choose to hear, but not really hear. They're going to choose to see, but not really see, even though Jesus continues to be revealed for who he is. He is the Son of the Most High God. Jesus then turns the table on the demons and demands a name from him, to which the demon responds, "My name is Legion, for we are many." People over the centuries have been fascinated by the name Legion and what that would look like in the relationship of the demons. But the reality is it's probably not a proper title at all. It's just a simple reference to that there are so many demons within this man. That a Roman legion was a unit of like 6,000 soldiers. Now that doesn't mean there's literally 6,000 demons, but there's a lot. Enough to move 2,000 pigs, we know that much. So there's a lot of demons in there. And the reason he says legion is most likely to avoid giving a proper name. He doesn't want Jesus to have that much more power over him when he knows he's already losing the battle. It's possible there's also a little bit of a boast in there. We will not be exorcised so easily, Jesus, because we are a legion and we are many. And yet despite this, despite all of the tactics and tries that this demon tries to pull on Jesus, none of it seems to work. They know that they're losing. They are powerless before the authority of Jesus. So instead of fighting it, they now begin to beg and see if they can get some sort of concession out of the deal. Well, maybe we could just stay in the region, right? Because this would have been Gentile territory where they probably thought they would have more power. They look around and they see a herd of pigs up on the hillside. And they say, well, let us enter the pigs, because it was believed and seems to be confirmed by what we see in the stories of the Gospels that demons hate a vacuum. They hate empty space. They want to be in and possess something. Jesus is clearly not giving up on the person, so they're like, well, the pigs are probably better than nothing. The irony being, especially from a Jewish point of view, when they would hear this story, is pigs are like the ultimate unclean animal. So the unclean spirit will enter the unclean pigs. And Jesus seems to grant the concession. He gives them permission as long as he leaves them, as long as the legion would leave the man to go and to enter this herd of pigs. Seemingly, though, the joke is actually on them. As they rush upon the pigs get worked up into a frenzy. For whatever reason, they can't seem to be able to control this giant herd, and so the herd of pigs rushes down into the sea, and there they drown and die. And it would seem the demons are destroyed along with them. And so the legion, despite their power, despite their wiles and their tricks, despite the sheer number, they are defeated before the power and the might of Jesus. Verse 14, it says, the herdsmen fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see it and what had happened. And they came to Jesus, and they saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. So the herdsmen, presumably the ones over the pigs, they run to go tell everyone they can find what had happened and what they had witnessed. So not too long later, a giant crowd seems to emerge to check out the scene. And what do they see? There's the demon-possessed man, possessed no more, clothed, calm, perfectly within his right mind. This man that they had chased from the city, this man that they had left to wander the tombs alone, this man they had tried to chain up like an animal because they didn't know what to do with him, now is healed and made well. Their response? They were afraid. Just like the disciples on the boat, they are afraid of anyone who has so much power, even if he uses it for their good. They fear Jesus because they cannot understand him. They fear Jesus because they cannot control him. And they actually seem far more concerned about the pigs than they do this actual person, which is tragic. It kind of makes me think actually of the opening scene of the movie The Incredibles, where like the basic plot line there is there's these superheroes, they're born with powers, and so some of them are villains and some of them are heroes, and they have these fights, right? And the heroes are trying to do good, they're protecting innocent lives, but because they're these superpower charged people, they end up causing a whole lot of property damage. And so the people, they can't control the supers, they can't understand the supers, and so they use the property damage as an excuse to try to make it make it illegal and outlawed to use powers at all. That's kind of what's happening here with Jesus. There's been some property damage, but that's not really the concern. They're using it as an excuse because they know they can't understand Jesus and they cannot control him. And so they began to beg him to leave. See, they have chosen fear. Their fear keeps them from having faith. Their lack of faith keeps them from having any actual understanding. Their lack of understanding keeps them from being with Jesus, the one who casts out demons, the one who heals the sick and brings good news. And in the final verses of our passage, verse 18, it says, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. But he did not permit him. But he said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy upon you. And so he went away and he began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So the man who had been demon-possessed seems to have actually the only positive response in these stories, and he asked Jesus for permission to get in the boat and to be able to follow Jesus, which, by the way, in Mark is typically the discipleship response, to say, I want to follow Jesus and go wherever Jesus goes. But Jesus tells the man no. Mark does not tell us directly why Jesus said no, but it becomes pretty obvious when you see the instructions that Jesus gives to this man instead. That the reason the man is told that he can't go is so that he can be sent back to be a witness for the gospel. Like earlier in the Gospel of Mark, we've seen Jesus silencing everyone, both demons and man, because in the Jewish culture, he was really worried that they wouldn't understand who the Messiah was. And that instead they would try to start some sort of political revolt over the Roman government. But this is Gentile territory. They come with no preconceived notions about what it means to be the Messiah. They have no desire to see some sort of Jewish rebellion happen. And so instead, this man can go and he can tell everyone what has happened so that those who have genuine curiosity will be prepared for when the full gospel will actually come to them. Also, be sure not to miss the significant statement that's also given about Jesus' divinity in these verses. Jesus tells the man, he says, tell him how much the Lord, which is the title for God, has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. What's the reference for God? And then the man obeys by telling everyone how much Jesus has done for him. And that would be the obedience to Jesus' command. See, this man has a much clearer understanding of who Jesus is, even clearer than the disciples who travel with him. And unlike the leper from chapter 1, this man doesn't just go and talk about miracles. He talks about who Jesus is, what Jesus has really done for his soul, and how he has had mercy upon him. See, this man has chosen faith, the only positive examples in the stories. That's a true discipleship response. A true discipleship response is to go and to tell everyone about who Jesus is and what he has done for us. If we do not engage in that response, it should tell us that we are choosing fear instead of faith. So that closes our two stories, and in both these stories, there's the major repeating themes. Who is Jesus? It's revealed by these authoritative works that he does, and people will respond with fear or faith. All of that leaves us with the question that we started earlier. Jesus has revealed who he is. How will we respond? We saw what it was for the disciples. We saw what it was for the city, but what will it be for us? Before we decide on that, let's just spend a moment considering what happens when we choose these responses. First, what happens when we choose to respond with fear? When we choose to respond with fear instead of faith, the first thing that happens is it means we reject Jesus. That's what fear actually is. When the disciples were in the boat, their fear led them to this rash rebuke of Jesus. Oh, you don't even love us. You don't even care that we're about to die. And when we allow fear to fill our hearts, that's what we do too. We're rejecting Jesus. We're saying, Jesus, I don't trust you. I don't think you love me. I don't think you have something better for me. I can't believe that. And so we choose a response of fear, and so we reject him. When the Gentile town is filled with fear, their response is much the same. They just straight up ask Jesus to leave, get out of our lives. Sadly, that's all too common of a response today as well. That people come to situations that are out of their control, that they do not understand, and rather than causing that to run to God, they choose a fear response and they run away from God, which fixes nothing, but leaves them without God in the picture. When the proper response would be to run to God, because that's the only way through any circumstance, especially ones we can't control, especially the ones that we can't understand. So when we choose fear, it's a rejection of Jesus. Second thing happens too, though, is that we tend to value then what benefits us, or what we think benefits us, a whole lot more than what seems to have value to God. In the specific case of the Gentile city, they chose pigs over people. Their fear about losing their property made them blind to the glory of someone who was actually healed. And when we are filled with fear, we too get so locked into what's right in front of us. We're afraid, so we try to cling to the only things that we think we can control, the things that we think we can understand, as if that would give us some sort of peace. Fear makes you selfish. We're afraid then to actually make sacrifices for other people. We're afraid to take risks and sacrifice for God because we are afraid. Fear keeps us from even being able to see the needs of other people because we're so locked into the needs that we think we have. And then the third thing happens when we choose fear instead of faith. That's that we still have no solutions to our problem. Fear fixes nothing. It's kind of like what Jesus says about worry. Jesus says about worry, he says, which of you by worrying can add a cubit to his height? Right? Like you spend all your time worrying, you're worried about all these things, and for what? Like what does that actually get you? How does that actually help you? It's the same thing with fear. It does nothing. It just paralyzes us. Fear tells us that we can do nothing. Fear tells us that God can do nothing. And so fear wants to make sure that nothing actually gets done. Fear fixes nothing. And that's why we need to choose to respond with faith. First thing that happens when we choose faith is then all of a sudden we are confident in the storm. As we said earlier, faith is the antidote for fear. When I read the story of Jesus' calming of the storm, it always makes me think of John Wesley's conversion. which I've shared before. But John Wesley was a minister, right? So he knew the gospel and would teach out of Scripture, but it hadn't really captivated his heart. And so there comes this time where he is on a missionary journey to share the gospel, even though it hadn't taken his heart. And there's a great storm that comes upon their boat. And Wesley huddles in a little corner of the boat, terrified about what's going to happen, unable to move. And then he looks over and he sees this other group of Christians. They were called Berean Christians, and they are huddled together in prayer. Passionate, fervent prayer, but also calm. They were fully confident that God could deliver them from the storm, and fully confident that even if he didn't, everything would still be okay, because in the gospel, all outcomes are ultimately good. It was at that point that Wesley knew that that was the faith that he needed to have. See, if we are confident and we choose faith instead of fear, then we don't fear anything. Like, we don't even fear death. We know we have something beyond the circumstances of this world, life or death. Now, again, to be clear, like, human emotions happen, right? That's okay. Like, you're going to experience fear in life. The question that's being raised here is not that are you going to be able to not have fear. The question is, when fear comes, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to allow that fear to control you and to paralyze you? Or are you going to instead take it to God and respond with faith and overcome it? Just like the Roosevelt quote that we had earlier, right? That courage is not this idea that I don't have fear. It's that I think there's something greater than my fear that compels me to actually face them. See, the disciples, they were understandably worried about the water in the boat. But they could have responded to Jesus in faith, not coming to rebuke him. And what a difference that could have made in their lives. Which leads us actually to a second thing that happens when we choose faith, as we can experience greater blessings. Because unlike fear, faith actually does something. It actually makes a difference. It gives us confidence and it brings greater blessings. Jesus saves the disciples from the storm. He heals the demon-possessed man, and that's with a lack of faith. Imagine what he could actually do if people had any amount of faith in the stories at all. Perhaps if there was a response of faith, the city wouldn't have pushed Jesus away. But they would invite him to stay. He could have healed. He could have taught. He could have done so much more in their area. What a blessing that could have been. But they chose fear. The disciples, instead of being rebuked for a lack of faith, could have been praised for their faith. Had more confidence than ever in their future and their understanding of who Jesus is. But they don't. And although not all of the miracles in the Bible are born out of faith, there's certainly a connection between faith in the miracles, even if that makes us a little uncomfortable. Now, I'm not saying that, like, if you have faith, then all of a sudden all your prayers are going to be answered and get whatever you want, because that's just simply not true, and that's not biblical. Nor am I saying anytime that you have asked God for something and he has said no, it's because you lacked faith. That also is not biblical. But there are greater blessings that come when we choose faith. If it was nothing else, you would at least be able to move forward with confidence, knowing you have the greatest blessings of all already in your possession. The blessings of forgiveness, salvation, eternal life, and Jesus, the ultimate prize that we are after. See, unlike fear, faith actually yields results. And then one last thing when we respond with faith is that we will go. And we will be sent, and we will tell others what Jesus has done for us. That is the faithful response in the passage. That's what the man does. He goes and he tells everybody. He gladly goes. He can't stop telling people what Jesus had done for him. And it raises the question for us, because if we are truly responding with faith, as I think we would all like to say we are, yet then we don't go and tell people about Jesus, that should tell us we are actually responding with fear instead of faith, because that is the discipleship response. That leaves the question for us, though. What will we choose? What do we choose in our everyday life? Here are just some reflection questions we can each ponder in our own hearts this morning. What areas of my life am I responding to with fear? Like, if I just looked at my life and I took inventory of my life, what areas would I point to and say, yeah, those are the areas where I'm responding to with fear instead of with faith? What would it take to change that into an actual faith response? To Jesus, he's revealed who he is. The question is, how is that shaping my life right now? How am I living different because of that truth? Because Jesus has made it clear. Am I living confidently? Am I living in those blessings of Jesus? Am I going and sharing with others what the Lord has done for me? If not, why am I allowing fear to paralyze me? Because then I have chosen fear instead of faith. See, Jesus has revealed who he is. The question then for us is, how will we respond? With faith or with fear? Let us pray together. Father, I thank you for your Son Jesus in the clear revelation of who he is. And I thank you that we have the invitation to respond to Jesus with faith. And that when we respond, that there are greater blessings, that there is a greater confidence that we can have, that faith actually changes things and moves things in our own lives as well as in the lives of others. But this morning we confess to you, Father, that far too often we have chosen a response of fear. In so many areas of our life, we have chosen fear, which means a rejection of who your Son really is. It means not being able to trust you in the storm. It means focusing on the things that we think would make us happy when they don't, instead of on the things that you value. We confess that, Father, and ask for your forgiveness, and we ask that you would help us to have a response of faith today. This morning, may you reveal in each of our hearts those areas where we are choosing fear. And may we cast that fear out with the power of faith. May you work in our hearts the power of your Holy Spirit to draw us closer to you. May we recognize and say, yes, we see who your Son is. We have ears to hear. We have eyes to see. We behold who your Son is, and so we respond with faith today. These things we pray in your mighty name. And all God's people said, amen.